A question music fans frequently ask when they encounter Lenny Breau's virtuosic fingerstyle jazz guitar playing for the first time is, how is it possible I've never heard of this guy? It's a reasonable question considering that we live in a world where even the smallest amount of talent can catapult an unknown to overnight celebrity status. Yet despite possessing musical gifts of such magnitude that Chet Atkins once called him the greatest guitarist who ever walked the face of the earth, Lenny Breau spent most of his professional life in relative obscurity. The dazzling guitar style that so impressed Atkins was a unique synthesis of jazz, flamenco, country, classical, and other musical genres that Lenny worked tirelessly to refine throughout his life. Along the way, he created new techniques that baffled and amazed even the most accomplished guitarists of his time. His music was captured on a handful of recordings that sold poorly during his lifetime, but are now considered by guitar aficionados to be among the most important and groundbreaking guitar recordings ever made. Using the Chet Atkins fingerstyle technique he had learned as a boy, Breau could simultaneously play melody, bass, and chordal accompaniment. Inspired by the sound of jazz pianist Bill Evans, he also began playing a custom 7-string guitar equipped with a high A, tuned an octave above the 5th string, allowing him to play notes originally only possible on piano. How is it then that such an enormously talented and innovative musician is only now, so many years after his mysterious death at the age of 43, finally beginning to receive the attention and acclaim that eluded him during his lifetime? This conundrum is perhaps best understood by looking at the life, times, and character of Lenny Breau, who at an early age dedicated himself to the passionate pursuit of a unique musical voice. Breau was born August 5, 1941, in Auburn, Maine, and moved with his family to Moncton, New Brunswick in 1948. His parents, Harold Breau and Betty Cody, were professional country and western musicians who performed and recorded from the mid-1930s until the mid-1970s. Lenny began playing guitar at the age of 8. When he was 12, he started a small band with friends, and by the age of 14, he was the lead guitarist for his parents' band, billed as Lone Pine Jr., playing Merle Travis and Chet Atkins instrumentals and occasionally singing. He made his first professional recordings in Westbrook, Maine at Event Records with Al Hawks at the age of 15 while working as a studio musician. Many of these recordings were released posthumously on the album Boy Wonder. Around 1959, Breau left his parents' country band after his father slapped him in the face for incorporating jazz improvisation into his playing with the group. He sought out local jazz musicians, performing at Winnipeg venues, and immersed himself in the city's thriving jazz scene, jamming at various clubs with Winnipeg's best jazz musicians. The most important of these in terms of Lenny's musical growth was Bob Erlandson, an older, experienced jazz pianist who recognized Lenny's talents and began to teach him jazz theory. Erlandson and Lenny began playing a regular nightly gig at the Stage Door Jazz Club, where Lenny developed his jazz chops and applied the jazz theory Erlandson was teaching him. Lenny also continued to work on his solo guitar playing. Chet Atkins had been his musical model for nearly a decade, but from 1960 onwards, Lenny's main influence was jazz pianist Bill Evans. Lenny connected deeply with Evans's music and would spend the next several decades transposing Evans's sophisticated modern harmonic and melodic concepts onto the guitar. This coincided with Lenny's discovery of flamenco guitar, which he loved for its powerful rhythms and emotional fire. Lenny incorporated both styles into his evolving approach to solo guitar playing. In 1961, Lenny was 20 years old. In some ways, he was a sophisticated young man who had seen and experienced more of the world than most of his peers. Yet Lenny retained throughout his life an almost childlike innocence that could make him appear younger than his years. These qualities, coupled with an exuberant, guileless candor and playful sense of humor, charmed people and would help to open doors for him professionally and socially. There was, however, a less positive consequence of his childlike demeanor. Having never been pressed to take on any responsibilities beyond practicing and performing, his basic life skills were underdeveloped, and as an adult he tended to depend on friends and acquaintances to handle the mundane demands of his day-to-day and professional life. In later years, Lenny's inability to look after himself would be a burden for him, particularly when his personal problems sometimes alienated those he relied on for help. But in the early days of his career, there was no shortage of people who were delighted to offer guidance and support to the personable and winning young creative artist. One of the first people to give Lenny's career a hand up was George Sukornyk, a lawyer and business entrepreneur who had driven to Winnipeg at the urging of a friend who had seen Lenny perform at the stage door. Astounded by what he saw, Sukornyk invited Lenny to be his guest at his home in Toronto and began to act as Lenny's manager. With Sukornyk's help, Lenny found his way into the Toronto jazz scene and immediately impressed local musicians. A few months after Lenny's arrival in Toronto, Sukornyk arranged a meeting between Lenny and jazz singer Tony Bennett. After a short audition, Bennett offered Lenny a job in his band, a plum proposition for the young musician considering Bennett's stature. Lenny was tempted but turned the offer down. In 1962, Breau briefly performed in the Toronto-based jazz group 3, with singer and actor Don Franks and Ian Henstridge. 3 performed in Toronto, Ottawa, and New York City. They recorded a live album at the Village Vanguard in New York City and appeared on the Jackie Gleason and Joey Bishop television shows. Returning to Winnipeg a few months later, Breau became a session guitarist and contributed to CBC TV's Teen Beat, Music Hop, and his own The Lenny Breau Show. During this period, he met his partner Judy Singh, with whom he had a daughter. In 1967, he managed to get a tape of one of his shows into Chet Atkins' hands in Nashville. Atkins was then vice president of RCA Records and immediately offered Lenny a recording contract. After some initial hesitation, Lenny flew to Nashville in April of 1968 to record his first album with 2 Winnipeg musicians. The trio recorded 2 albums for RCA, Guitar Sounds of Lenny Breau, which Chet Atkins produced in 1968, and its follow-up, The Velvet Touch of Lenny Breau Live, recorded in Los Angeles a year later. On both albums, Lenny played electric and nylon string guitar as well as a modified 12-string electric guitar. The material ranged from jazz, pop, and country standards to flamenco, folk, and Indian-influenced music. Both albums are now considered quintessential classics of the fingerstyle jazz genre. Lenny's musical style and career had gathered momentum throughout the 1960s. Now, with 2 albums on a major label and regular work with some of Canada's top jazz musicians, he seemed poised to make a significant professional leap forward. But it was not to be. His 2 RCA albums sold poorly. Pop audiences found his music too jazz-oriented, and his music was unappealing to many old-school jazz purists. Younger jazz fans drawn to the more bombastic jazz fusion sounds of Miles Davis paid little attention to Lenny's recordings. The lack of attention his albums received disappointed Lenny, and he did little to help their sales. He avoided meetings to discuss RCA's promotional plans for the albums, which had included an international tour. "He just wasn't ambitious in a commercial sense," said Lenny's close friend Ron Haldorson. "He was striving to accomplish what he wanted to do as a player." This attitude did not endear him to RCA or his manager. Eventually, both lost interest and ended their business relationships. Lenny was now left to his own meager resources to manage a career that was rapidly failing. His inability to look after himself and his interest was worsened by his growing drug use. In the early 1960s, like countless other people of his generation, Lenny had begun to experiment with LSD and marijuana, claiming that these drugs enhanced his creative process. He began using heroin when it was available, and heavy doses of methadone when it was not. His addiction made him undependable, and clubs were reluctant to book him. He toured with Anne Murray's band in 1972, but Murray fired him when his drug use interfered with the band's performances. For the next 5 years, Lenny moved sporadically from one Canadian city to another, playing small gigs where and when he could find them. Attempts at beating his addiction were short-lived and ineffective, even after a court-ordered stay in rehab in Winnipeg, where he was busted for heroin possession. In 1976, he did manage to kick heroin with the help of a musician friend while living in a commune in Ontario. Soon after, he was busted for possession of marijuana with intent to traffic and fled to the United States, where his substance use continued, while he made a living playing clubs in central Maine. A year later, at Chet Atkins' urging, Lenny returned to Nashville and began playing a nightly restaurant gig that Atkins had arranged for him. Although he continued to struggle with addiction, the next few years were relatively fruitful ones for Lenny, particularly in terms of his recorded output. This included 2 excellent albums recorded in Chet Atkins' home studio: the legendary Lenny Breau Live and Standard Brands, a duet album with Atkins. He also recorded for Adelphi Records in New York City. Adelphi's founder Gene Rosenthal had heard Lenny play in a small Nashville club. Rosenthal offered him a recording contract on the spot. Lenny was hesitant, but eventually went to New York to record material for 3 albums: 5 O'Clock Bells, Breau, and Last Sessions. There were other signs that Lenny's career was moving up. Scott Page, a musician with 1970s pop duo Seals and Croft, brought Lenny to Los Angeles for a string of well-attended shows at local jazz clubs. After clearing up legal hurdles with help from his old friend Don Franks, Lenny returned to Toronto to play a string of successful dates at the Bourbon Street Jazz Club. After his stint at Bourbon Street in 1980, Lenny flew to Winnipeg to kick off a 5-city Canadian tour. Promotion and ticket sales were excellent, and a large crowd turned out to welcome their hometown hero. However, Lenny showed up inebriated when he took the stage and delivered a disastrous performance. All subsequent concerts were canceled. Lenny returned to the United States and would never set foot on Canadian soil again. Lenny spent his last years in Los Angeles performing regularly at Dante's Jazz Club. His audiences often included top jazz guitarists such as Pat Metheny and Phil Upchurch. Despite this recognition by his peers, his audiences were relatively small. According to jazz drummer Joey Barron, LA music fans had little interest in Lenny's music. Most of Lenny's income during this period came from teaching privately and at the Guitar Institute of Technology. His workshops were enormously successful, and the school was on the verge of hiring Lenny as a full-time teacher. Sadly, Lenny did not have the chance to assume this position. On the morning of August 12, 1984, 1 week after his 43rd birthday, Lenny Breau's body was found floating in his apartment building's rooftop pool. Initially, it appeared that Lenny had drowned after a night of binge drinking, an activity in which he indulged occasionally since getting off drugs a few years earlier. Within hours, however, the police determined that he had been strangled before being tossed into the pool. Lenny's wife, Jewel, became their main suspect. Lenny had met Jewel Glasscock in Nashville in 1980, and the pair married a year later. Jewel and Lenny's relationship was tumultuous and difficult. Several of Lenny's friends told police they had witnessed an enraged Jewel hit and choke Lenny on several occasions. Lenny admitted to friends that he was afraid of Jewel and had left her several times, staying with friends and family until she tracked him down and brought him back home. On one occasion in Nashville, Lenny had taken out a restraining order to keep Jewel away. The police questioned Jewel and considered her a suspect for a time, but evidence was not strong enough to bring charges against her. Officially, Lenny's murder remains unsolved. In the years immediately following his death, aside from the memories of friends, family members, and die-hard fans, Lenny Breau's contribution to jazz guitar was overlooked and largely forgotten. As the years passed, Lenny Breau seemed destined to be at best a minor footnote in the history of jazz guitar. Jazz guitarist George Benson once said of Lenny, "There's such a thing as being ahead of your time." This may well be the case because over the past 20 years, there has been ample evidence the music world is catching up with Lenny Breau. New releases, including Boy Wonder, were well promoted and began to spawn a new fan base for Lenny's music. In 1999, Lenny's daughter Emily Hughes put together a well-researched, detailed documentary on the life and music of her father, which appeared on the Bravo network. In 2000, Lenny's close friend and fingerstyle jazz guitarist Steven Anderson published Visions, an in-depth instruction book on Lenny's style. While he may never become a household name, fewer and fewer people are now asking, "How is it possible I've never heard of this guy?" This is James from One Track Jazz. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment.